Hello and welcome to TechPod Talks. Here we do candid conversations with leaders that are building what's next. I'm Stephen Koza. I'm the CEO here at EverOps. And every episode we bring in somebody that's a true practitioner, somebody actually in the arena to tell us what's happening behind the scenes in platform engineering and cloud and DevOps, and more importantly, technical leadership. So really excited to have our guest on today. He is exactly that kind of person. His name is Mark Sass. And Mark, I got to tell you, you've got one of the most interesting career arcs that I've seen in platform engineering. So Mark has built SRE teams at Home Depot, managing payment infrastructure for thousands of stores and hundreds of billions of dollars in transactions. He's led engineering teams at Meta. More recently, Senior Director of Online Engineering at 2K Games, which is one of the biggest names in gaming, building the infrastructure behind titles that some of you have probably played. Also holds an MBA from Texas A&M. I won't hold that against you. Mark knows that I went to the rival University of Texas. And today, Mark is Senior Director of Platform Engineering at SolarWinds, which is a company in the middle of a pretty major transformation. And I'll let him tell you more about that. And so, Mark, welcome to TechPod Talks.
Thanks, Stephen. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's good to catch up since we've known each other for a little while. So, Mark, I want to start with your career. You've told me about it, and we've certainly done some research to fill in some of the blanks. You've done some pretty interesting work across some household names: Home Depot, Meta, Indeed, 2K Games, now SolarWinds. Those are all pretty different companies. What's the thread that connects all of them for you?
It's an interesting question. So you have to go back a little bit farther than what you have listed there. So years and years ago, I was a technical trainer. I got tired of doing a lot of the teaching and wanted to work on practice. So I started working for a startup and during the dot-com bubble, and started working on the practical experience of that. And then I started my own consulting practice. And then I did some more time in startups. And so, and what I've done is I've kind of bobbed earlier in my career between startups where I absolutely love the agility and the problem solving and doing stuff with a shoestring budget. I get frustrated with that, and I move to a bigger company like a Dell or a Visa that are way back in the time machine for me, where we had all this budget and just really slow and bureaucratic processes. And so I've kind of bounced between those companies. And so recently I've kind of settled into the mid-sized companies, although can't really tell with the time at Meta and Home Depot. Those are really large companies that had great opportunities, but Indeed was a relatively small company. 2K was a relatively small company, and SolarWinds is not a huge company as well. So I really like the opportunities there to really flex the technology, but also flex leadership skills where there's opportunities for us to grow the organization and grow the careers of people who work for me.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing. I want to ask about the MBA because I think that's pretty unique. I don't see that a ton in technical leadership. Certainly, there's some folks like you, but they're the minority, not the majority. So tell me, how does having that business lens change the way you think about technical decisions? And then also, what was the motivator? Why go do that?
Oh, so that's even a better story. So I actually went to Texas A&M out of high school. I was a terrible student. If they had the diagnosis at that time, I probably would have ADHD or on the spectrum there. I couldn't focus, and so I had to go through the school of hard knocks. And when I started working at Dell back in 2013, they offered free tuition or helpful with the tuition. And so I was like, well, now's a chance. So I went back, and I didn't get my degree in computer science like I studied at college. I went to a management because the idea was like, what's the quickest way for me to get my degree? And the irony of that is the reason why I decided to get my degree is because I had applied for a job at EA, a competitor to 2K, and they loved me, but they said, you don't have a degree, we can't hire you. And so I started seeing that as a glass ceiling for me. So I got my degree at an online university. And then I was like, the problems that I was facing at Dell, because this was during my Dell time, was there was a lot of conversation about CapEx and OpEx and amortization. And there was, I was having conversations with product people and marketing people and all these other things. And I understood what they were saying, but I didn't really understand what it meant for me. And so the lens that it changed for me, at least from that perspective, is up to that point, I'd been in IT and other places where I just kept asking for money. And I had no way to really articulate why that was valuable, where the value came from spending money. And so the MBA really kind of opened that lens up to me, started making me think about things like a return on investment for what we wanted to do. It allowed me to understand how product marketing works and how to exercise that muscle to say, I'm not just building a service that people take advantage of, I'm building a product and make and understand my customers so that when I built that product, I had a feeling for what they wanted and I can go deliver it. And it became a partnership collaborative event that I did, as opposed to what I did normally in the IT world, which is like, I'm going to do this stuff and it's going to make my life easier. I try to make it, how can I make it easier for the customer? So that was really what it gained for me, was just that insight to be able to understand how to talk to the finance people, how to talk to product people, how to talk to executives that I lacked before then.
I was also not a great student, at least in my early years. I don't know if I should out myself, but University of Texas told me if I don't get better grades after my first semester, that they weren't going to let me stay in the engineering school in my second semester. So I had to figure that out too. I never did the MBA. I kind of wish I did. I was always, I don't know if you call it a regret, but recognize a lot of the value. Well, what advice would you have for people earlier in their career that want to do that, but maybe it's not in the cards? Maybe they can't afford it. Maybe they don't want to carve the time out, but still want the kind of benefits that you mentioned, the ability to understand the other perspective.
One of the things that I advise a lot of people that work for me is, map out your next 10 years, and try to figure out where you want to be in 10 years from now. And that kind of helps drive the situation. So if I have people who are engineers and they're like, I want to be a principal engineer, I want to stay in the technology field and just be an engineer, that's a far different path than someone that says, I'm looking into management. That's the place I want to go. And unfortunately, a lot of companies today actually kind of top out engineers to where the only way they can continue to grow their career is to move to management. And I think that's a mistake. So what I would say for most people is figure out like what do you want to do in 10 years, where you want to take your career. And then, and of course, that is like, super high level. You could be, if you're a software engineer, you may say, I want to be a director of software engineering in 10 years. And the idea there is then map that out and say, okay, if I want to be there in 10 years, where do I need to be in 5? And if I want to be there in 5, what do I have to accomplish in 3? And if I want to be there in 3, what do I have to do in the next year? And the idea around that is then it gives you, more realistic goals of how you achieve that, and kind of stair step up. And if you're looking to move into leadership, that's when you start thinking about, how do I build the skill set that's needed for leadership? A technical person might be thinking, I need to understand bigger architecture. I need to, understand scaling. But someone who wants to move into leadership might start reading books like The 5 Dysfunctional Teams, or five Levels of Leadership, or Extreme Ownership, or all these. There's literally, you can't throw a rock without hitting a book about leadership, but they might try to define like a leadership ethos that they want to follow. And then they want to start understanding the skill sets that engineering backgrounds don't give you, like how to have a hard conversation, how to motivate people, all these type of things that come into play. And then the business stuff will naturally flow beyond that. It's like, okay, now I can lead. Now I need to understand how to talk to my peers and how to talk to the business side of the other folks.
Yeah, love the book Rex. By the way, I didn't prep you for that, but a couple of good ones in there. Mark, let's pivot a little bit more into your career and some of the places you've been. And the way I want to do that is focus on a couple specific topics that maybe there was an arc or some common threads across your different roles. And that topic I want to talk about is cost efficiency. So based on what I know about you and how we've gotten to know each other, that's been an area you've driven some pretty significant impact around. And back to the MBA conversation we just had, I'm not surprised why that is. And so I know that in at least one of your roles, you were able to shave a pretty significant amount off your cloud bill. In fact, maybe at a couple companies, and I don't want to put words in your mouth or misrepresent. And so I'd love if you could just walk us through your mental model when you come into a new company or a new role. What are you looking for, and how do you wrap your arms around not just current state and where a company is or where their infrastructure costs are, but how do you actually start looking for the opportunities? Well, What are the questions you ask? What's the data? What are the things you're poking at to form an opinion before you get into action mode?
Sure. So one of the first questions I try to understand, or one of the first topics I understand, is how does the COGS versus R&D conversation happen? What is considered COGS? What's considered R&D? What are the expected values out there from the finance group? So understand the budget, understanding how they do forecasts at that point. And then from a technical perspective, I start diving into how they manage that process now. How are they managing cost controls? And so one of the things I've noticed at the last few companies I have is that, you know, companies really jump into the cloud and all the great things it gives you, which is that, kind of instant gratification, for lack of a better way to describe it, compared to what it was in the data center days, where if you ask for an VM, it might take weeks. And now you can get a virtual machine or an EC2 instance in minutes, and you can stand up large clusters and you can do all this work in seconds. But generally what people forget about is that's all OpEx, number one, which is, more costly on a bottom line generally than data centers. But the other thing is that if there's not the proper governance, you lose track of who's spun that up, what its purpose was, what it's being used for. And so the first thing I talked about, like at 2K, and even I've had that problem here at my new company, is what's the tagging structure that we have? What are the requirements that have been put in place to look at this? How do we establish ownership of infrastructure? And that's kind of the big thing, is that if you have good tagging strategy, then you can start aligning your costs better to what the finance teams want to see and the business owners want to see. If you don't do that, then it becomes really difficult to cost optimize. And then the other thing you need to figure out is you're looking at how we're spending money in terms of, is there a significant amount of on-demand spend if we're talking about the clouds versus compute savings plans if we're talking AWS? What's that value at? How are they doing those calculations if they are doing it? And where we can get some easy, quick savings, quick wins by doing stuff like compute savings plans. And that's something what we did at 2K was, we didn't have a tagging strategy when I started. We started tagging stuff. And the problem is, the older your company gets, the harder it is to track down how things should be tagged. And so you start, I won't say taking shortcuts, but you start tagging things into a bucket that's like, I'll go look at it later almost. And those are the parts where you might save, 5 or 10% on your bill. But then, like I said, going to look at, how you're spending, what, understanding your demand curve of your services. So like in the 2K world, there was a very unicameral kind of view of it. It went up during the day, went down at night. And so you're trying to, and then understand how are we auto scaling to match that demand curve, that demand curve of the services that you have, so you can get your supply curve above that. So those kind of things I'm looking at is trying to understand how the business functions, how the business recognizes the costs, and then where are some quick, easy wins that we can get to, and setting ourselves up for a longer term success through like a tagging strategy to help us out that way.
I'm curious. You and I have talked about tagging strategies in the past, so I'm not surprised to hear you bring that one up. When you look at a cost savings opportunity and you try and figure, like, you've got the data now, it's tagged, you understand where maybe the over provisioned resources are. Is it usually a people problem or a process problem or a technology problem, or is it all of them?
It's kind of all of them in that sense, because it's probably more related to time. If you think about the way the cycles work, the dev cycles work with developers or even engineers, they're focused on, I need to deliver product, I need to deliver services to my customers, whether those are internal customers or external customers. And so the things that get dropped are the things that are about cost optimization, because those take time to research and go into it from that perspective. There are tools out there that'll make great recommendations to you, but even though you look at those recommendations where it says, oh, you can save $50,000 a month by turning on intelligent tiering, inside your S3 buckets, that's an easy win until you start looking at how you're using that. And, you got to go then understand the data lifecycle of that. And so I think that's the biggest problem, is time to get people to focus on. So one of the things I've been successful at 2K and that I'm implementing here is getting that ability to push that ownership to the teams that can have control over that. So, in a lot of cases, like 2K, my journey was really interesting. I was given the control of cloud, and they say, you own the cloud. So I started looking at our spend, and I was like, oh my gosh, we're spending so much money. And I would start saying, we need to stop doing this. We need to stop doing this. We need to stop doing this. And we saved a lot of money. But then 6 months later, we were in the same situation. And so I was like, okay, let me go look around and see how I can save money. And I realized that I was doing that wrong to a certain extent because the people that were spending the money, weren't my teams. They were other teams. And so one of the things that I've implemented at 2K and I'm implementing at my current company, SolarWinds, is the idea of pushing budgets onto these teams for the services they run. So they now have a budget that's been established. And it's now their responsibility to understand and giving them visibility of what they're spending. So they now control that of making sure that they're meeting those budgets. So if finance comes and says you have $1 million a month or you have $1 million, divide it amongst all the different services, give them a budget, let them focus on it. Then if they're out of bounds, I don't have to be the bad guy. They get a roll up, their manager gets a roll up, the director gets a roll up, the senior director gets a roll up and says, if it all washes at the higher level, nobody's going to care. But if it starts looking over, people are going to start looking at that. And then that's when they can come back to my teams, the SRE teams generally, and try to understand how can we cost optimize. And so what you're really trying to do is put some guardrails on them so that, they don't spend too much and they don't cut corners too much, because that's burned you as well, where, some of the services within AWS specifically, if you move them down too small, they could be knocked off the network if they're using too much network traffic and unexpectedly. And so that causes outages that you don't want to have. So you're trying to, like I said, put those guardrails out there.
You know what, that makes me kind of wonder, once, let's say you're successful, each consumer owns the budget, there's some built-in accountability there. But I imagine that alone probably doesn't just magic wand solve the cost problem. So I'm curious, when you find something that's inefficient and there's an opportunity to modernize or cost optimize, say something's over provisioned or a architecture doesn't make sense, how do you actually get the buy-in to make a major change, even once you've done the budgeting thing where the departments have that pressure? I imagine there's more required. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So there's kind of two pieces to that. The way to help drive cost optimization is really giving some data-driven metrics that help those customers understand what they're spending and where they're at. So one of the things we talked about at 2K was driving what I refer to as the utilization metric, which is what is the percentage of utilization we have our Kubernetes cluster and what's our goal. So if our goal is 80% and we're sitting at 60%, we're effectively wasting 20% of our spend because we're not where we need to be. On the other side of the equation, you have the application saturation metric, which is how much capacity have I provisioned and how much am I actively using. So if I've got 1,000 TPS out there and I'm using 300, I'm at 30%. Now, once again, when I surface these metrics, it's not my job to say this is good or bad. It's the product team's decision on where they want to be. If 30% is where they think they need to be, have at it. That's their point. But if they want to be aiming for 80%, then they need to understand that they need to make changes to their provision. So that's one side of the equation, is giving them really good metrics that help them drive the conversation of what they're spending currently. And then when we start talking about like architectural discussions, those become very interesting, because then you need to really understand the application structure, how they've designed it. And unfortunately, you get into a situation where decisions were made long before you got there that have just been built upon for years and years and years and years. And so then it becomes, okay, what do we do to fix that problem? Is it a complete, almost like a rewriting of the entire architecture, or are there some simple changes? And those are where you get into conversations like I just had this conversation. I won't go into details, where I'm setting up a bunch of architect/principal engineers to talk about how we can build more resiliency into some of our services, because we have some single points of failure that are causing us problems here at my company. And so then it becomes a collaborative effort to say, okay, and this is what I tell my team all the time. It's like, if this is where we're at and this is what good looks like, what's our plan to get from place to place? And in a lot of cases, teams don't know what good looks like. They really don't know where they should be. They just know where they're at, and they're kind of moving in the direction of what they think it is. So really kind of formulating that big picture idea of like, this is what I think good looks like, and then making sure everybody buys into it and go in that direction. It gives them the path to say, okay, now we can look at what good looks like, and it helps them understand that path forward to getting to that final architecture. And sometimes, like I said, that's a complete wipe. Sometimes that is, tweaks that we can do, some tactical changes we can do to make that happen. Super.
we've known each other for a little while, and I think that's one of the things we as a company pride ourselves on is we get to work with lots of different clients and lots of different orgs, and as a result know what good looks like. And I know you've led teams at a bunch of different companies at probably pretty different scales. And so keying off that, if you look across gaming and social media and retail and all these different industries, I'd love to start talking about leadership. And first question is, tell me a little bit about your leadership style and how it's changed over the years, and not necessarily what you might have done differently, but how have you changed org to org, and what have you learned, and how's that evolved as your career has grown?
Yeah. So great question. So earlier in my career, a lot of Mark lore here, backstory lore here for me. But my wife stayed at home to take care of our 4 children, and so I was the only person there. So I kind of drove my career off of what gets me more money and what gets me, up the ladder more. And so like I moved into management positions naturally because I generally would step into a leadership role within the team and then just moved into management. And I really didn't have what I would consider a leadership ethos. What I was doing was like, I didn't like this when I was an engineer, so I'm not going to do that. And so not the best way to pick a leadership, but then, probably 15, almost 20 years ago, it came across that I needed to figure out, like, I need to pick a path. And there are, an immense amount of different types of authoritarian or relationships, like authoritarian or democrative, or I can't say that word, but democracy related ones. Or the one that really kind of stood out to me is the servant leadership. And the reason why that one stood out for me is because in reality, I find far more interest in helping people maneuver their careers than necessarily the technology itself. I love solving complex problems, but so for me, I gravitated towards how do I help my teams and enable my teams to be better so that I look good by their improved productivity, their improved capabilities, and do it that way. But I take a lot of pieces from other places, in terms of like sometimes you have to be authoritarian, right? I mean, I've been in lots of meetings where there's been, discussions on how we solve a problem, and there are boils into 2 or 3 camps, and I have to make a decision, say we're going this way, and that's the way we're going to do it. And then there's other places where I've had to use more democratic principles, where it's like, what do we want to do? What's the best case? And so you have to go through kind of this mentality of what works best with the team you have. So if you have a team that is already going through the motions, have already been high performing, then it's a different vibe than if you're trying to build a team up. And I think the best example I have is like if you there's a book out there called Extreme Ownership, which I'm actually doing as a book club with almost every company I've worked for over the last 5 companies. And one of the great things they talk about inside there is in the first section there's about they have these boat crews. It's about Navy SEALs, about boat crews. And there's one team that's always winning and one team that's always in last. And the people in last, they're not treated really nicely. So you really don't want to be in last. And they took the leaders and switched them. So the person that was leading the winning team was now at the back, and the team that was winning still had the team that had been, the leader that had been at the back all the time. And what they saw was that leader that was, at the back, he took over a high performing team, and he was able to keep it going. They were consistently finishing first or second in all the competitions. But then over that same period of time, that leader who had built that team in the first place was able to come in and really drive that team up. So now they were competing with that first place team. And so you got to understand what kind of leader you are. Can you do both? A lot of people can't. A lot of people, it's really struggle to how you build, camaraderie, build a mission, build a vision into a team that delivers and drives those results from a dysfunctional team to a high performing team. That is a far different problem from a leadership perspective.
Yeah, 100%. I was chuckling when you gave the book example because and I promise we didn't actually prep for this, but I'm literally reading that book right now, and I literally just finished the chapter of the example you gave, Boat Crew 2, Boat Crew 6. So I'm not making that up. Yeah, how funny. Yeah, good book so far. So since you mentioned and you shared some of the initial motivations for getting into leadership and then how that's changed, what advice would you have for early in career engineering managers? And specifically, what do you think the best or the biggest misconception is that folks have about what the job actually is?
Generally, what you see happen for someone who was an engineer and moves into an engineering leadership position is that they were the best on that team. And what people don't understand a lot of times is what got you promoted, what got you into that engineering leadership role is not what makes you successful there. And that's the big misconception that a lot of people have. So a lot of people, they step into a leadership role and, the worst case scenario is they step into a leadership role of the team they used to lead because the dynamic completely changes. You go from a buddy that you can share all, your gripes and complaints to someone's like, oh, they're on the other side of the equation now. They're the bad guys in this case. And so that's one good thing. But for leaders who are stepping into a new leadership role on a team they haven't been a part of, I think the biggest thing as an engineering is learning to let go. Right. So first off, you need to figure out what your leadership ethos is going to be. What kind of a leader do I want to be? And then from there, you also need to turn around and say, okay, looking at my team, looking at who's on that team, who are the people that have the most, influence across that team? And that's the person you need to figure out how you can work side by side with, because that's the person that makes or breaks your success on that team. Is if you get someone who's the most influential person on that team and they're at odds with you, it's going to make for a bad relationship. If they become your partner and your friend and your ability to leverage them, then they can leverage the whole team across the board. And so as a new engineering leader, that's really what it is. I think the last thing that I would say is too many engineering leaders don't use enough context when they're describing things. So like, what's the business outcome of why we're doing this work? So a lot of people say, go do this work. Some director will come down to a manager and say, we need this done. That engineering leader may not get context of what they're trying to do, what the purpose of this work is. And so they just pass it on and people do it. But then they're shocked that the results don't match what the expectations were. And so understanding like why I'm doing this work is critically important. So you explain the why to the team as well, so that they can then build, based off of that rather than just building to it. And there's that funny meme you see out there where it's like, this is what the customer wanted, and it shows a nice swing under a tree. And then there's all these different things that are come about because of the lack of translation. And so trying to make sure you translate that mission, that vision, the business context and outcomes that you're looking for are critically important for an engineer leader.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. That you got me thinking about. So my background, a little different. Started in engineering, kind of pivoted to business and sales early on. So I led sales teams for a long time. And I always just took it for granted that those types of folks, they have to get the business problem and be thinking about the business value and that sort of thing, because that's going to make you successful or unsuccessful. And then joining Everops, spending more time with engineering teams and technical leaders, not so much the leaders, but I took it for granted the value and understanding that perspective and that lens. And so I always encourage our team, ask the why questions. You're doing something, why? What's the benefit? What's the value? What are you hoping to achieve? Why is that important? And I think we're getting there, and hopefully I'm sure you've gotten your teams there. So let me kind of pivot to some of the unsexy parts of leadership. So you gave me a good maybe segue on this. You talked about, getting to know the individuals and their motivations and having to get them on board. So do you have an example of a moment where maybe there was a challenge, team morale was not in a great place? The book example you gave a minute ago, and tell me about that. What was happening? How did you know it was an issue? Was it a crisis? Did you prevent a crisis? I'd love to hear a little bit about something real world that you've navigated.
Yeah. So I think what I'll say is in general, you see this a lot on teams that are behind the scenes. And what I mean behind the scenes is like, if I look at a team that's building a product and they're interacting with the customer and they're dealing with solving customer problems and adding features to do that, that's great. But like generally my experience has been on the SRE side, the infrastructure side. So we're one layer at least removed from those customers. And so a lot of times that can feel like you're a second-class citizen, for lack of a better describe it. And an example that we have here at SolarWinds is on-call is dreadful, right? And what I mean by that is just a lot of incidents going on, and they're not serious incidents, but there's just a lot of noise in the system. And it causes a morale problem because when people are on call, it's like, my phone's going to go off, several hundred times over my 12 or 24-hour shift, what is, and they're tethered to their computer and everything else like that. And so really what you got to do is like, understand, it's almost like a blameless postmortem you have to go through. Is like, okay, what is leading to this poor morale? And then you got to keep asking yourself, why is that the case? So like, when I started here, it's like, why are the engineers, experiencing so much dread about being on call? It's because there's so many incidents. Well, why are there so much incidents coming on? And so you start going down the path of trying to figure out why. And so that's a big, big play there. And then I think another thing that most engineers or most engineering leaders, need to understand as well is that in general, it's not what you demand from your team, it's more of what you accept. And so if you think about, you have an engineer who's underperforming, you can't miss the potential performance impact that has on the rest of the team, because if someone's putting in their 40 or 50 hours and they're doing the best they can, and then someone's seems to be coasting, that's going to impact the team as well. So I always boil things down. There's like a will and a skill problem. So it's, do they have the will to do the job, or do they have the skill to do the job? And you answer those questions on an individual motivation basis, but then understand the impact on the team of what's happening to the team because of those issues that they're having, and how we can get the team to build them up. So it goes back to that, that extreme ownership book. There are several places inside there where they talk about a situation where one team is complaining about another team not doing their best. And so they just don't understand what that other team needs. And so it's a matter of reach across the aisle and try to figure out, how do I help my other engineers do better? How do I help my teams do better? And really trying to understand those problem spaces.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great perspective. I imagine you've probably had a bunch of great leaders and mentors over the years. Anybody specifically that stands out, and you can name them or not, but more importantly, what did they teach you, or what did you learn from them?
I won't name his name, but he was my executive director at Dell. Great guy. He was the one who actually, brought me in and said, what do you want to do with your life, essentially? Right? Because at that point, I was a senior manager at Dell. I was running the backup and infrastructure environment over there, and I was relatively successful. But he was like, "What's your next steps? What do you want to go to life?" And I'd never thought about it at that point. And I was in my 40s, to be honest. I was probably early 40s, and so that's really kind of a eye-opening moment when you turn around and say, "Well, I don't know what the end game is." And I think that was extremely valuable to me to help out. That 10-year plan I talked about, what I set in front of my engineer, everybody who reports to me, I asked them politely to fill out that 10-year plan of where they want to be in 10 years. And I share mine. The good news, the 10-year plan is now retirement. So I get to, ease off on career goals and everything like that. But, that's really what kind of drove me to go back to school. What drove me to get my MBA is that I started thinking, this is where I want to be. And it's funny because if you had talked to me during my MBA time, I was like, I want to be a C-suite executive. That's what I want to be. I want to be a COO or a CTO or something like that. And then as I got farther along in my career, I was like, no, that's okay. I was like, this right now, what I'm at right now, I would consider somewhat a terminal level, maybe get to VP someday. But, I'm perfectly happy doing what I'm doing right now. And I have no desire to move up into more political offices that have the C in front of them, right? So you change you got to make sure you're constantly looking at, is that still what I want to do, and revisit it relatively often to see if you're still on track with what you want to do.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, definitely interesting how your motivations and what you value and how you weight those things changes throughout your life, especially once you have a family and kids. And I know you got a bunch of them, so not surprised. Mark, thank you. This has been genuinely pretty interesting, and I really, really appreciate you carving out the time. Thanks for being so candid and a little vulnerable and sharing some great insights. I love the book recommendations. I love the earlier in career mentorship story. So listeners, everything Mark mentioned today will be in the show notes. And Mark, I think you mentioned your LinkedIn is probably the best place to find you. So we'll include that as well. And there we go. That's it for this episode of Tech Pod Talks. If you enjoyed it and you got something valuable out of it, please share it with somebody else that's building platforms at scale and leading teams. That's who we're making this for. I'm Stephen Koza with Everops, and see you on the next episode.